Imagine walking into an old, dusty saloon in Dodge City in the year 1875. You see a woman wearing a bright red dress. She's leaning on the piano and smiling at a cowboy. You might think it looks fun or romantic, like something from a movie. But what you're really looking at is something very sad. The story of the prostitute with a good heart is one of the biggest lies ever told about the old American West. The truth for these women was a really hard life full of violence, sickness, and dying young. They were not free women making good money by choice, but very sad people stuck in a system that used them up and threw them away. Most of these women did not pick this life because they wanted adventure or easy cash. Many of them were women whose husbands had died in the Civil War, or young girls whose families had left them behind. Back then, there were almost no jobs for women, so this was often the only way to not go hungry. There was a ranking system among these women, and the woman standing by the piano was actually one of the better off ones. She was called a hurdy-gurdy girl, and her main job was to dance with the men and get them to buy drinks. She got a cut of every bottle of whiskey the cowboy bought, while she sipped cold tea that just looked like alcohol. But for every girl dancing in the hall, there were about 10 women working in tiny, hidden shacks called cribs. These were small wooden shacks behind the saloon that were barely big enough to fit a mattress and a wash bowl. This was the worst situation of all, where women sold their bodies for as little as 25 cents. The cribs were usually just thin wooden boxes that were freezing cold in the winter and burning hot in the summer. There was no privacy, and you could hear everything happening in the shacks next door through the thin walls. A woman working there might have to be with 20 or 30 men in just one night just to pay her rent. Please take a quick moment to click the subscribe button if you like these deep dives into history. It helps me keep going on the internet and keep making these videos for you. Thank you so much for your support. The cleanliness in these places was really terrible because they didn't have running water. The women used a bowl of water and a rag to clean themselves and their customers between visits. By the end of the night, that water was full of germs and other gross stuff. This lack of cleanliness meant that sexually transmitted diseases were something almost impossible to avoid. Diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea spread through these areas very fast, like a wildfire. There were no medicines like we have today, and getting syphilis basically meant a slow and painful death. The treatments doctors used back then were often more dangerous than the disease itself. Doctors gave patients mercury, which is a heavy metal that destroys your brain and kidneys. There was a dark joke that went, one night with Venus and a lifetime with Mercury, and everyone knew what it meant. To deal with the physical pain and the deep shame they felt every day, almost all of them started using substances. Alcohol was the most common way to kill the pain, and many of these women were serious alcoholics by the time they were 20. But the thing that really killed them was a mix of opium and alcohol called laudanum. Laudanum was sold in stores as a medicine for things like headaches or stomach cramps. The women would drink whole bottles of it to numb their minds and get through the horror of their nights. It was very addictive, and taking too much of it was the most common way a saloon girl died. Suicide was so common among these women in the West that newspapers often just stopped writing about it. They would drink a bottle of a dangerous chemical or shoot themselves alone in their rooms. It was the one last way they could be in control in a life where they had zero say over what happened to their own bodies. I have a tough question for you to think about and answer in the comments below about this sad story. Do you think the saloon girl had a harder life than a coal miner? Or were they both equally suffering because of the times they lived in? I'd really love to hear what you think about this. Pregnancy was something these women were constantly scared of because raising a baby in a brothel was impossible. Birth control back then was very basic and involved dangerous chemical washes that burned their skin. When those didn't work, they had to get secret abortions done by people who had no medical training. These procedures were done in dirty places with no painkillers and by untrained people. The chance of getting a bad infection or bleeding too much was extremely high, and many women died on dirty tables. Getting pregnant was not a happy thing, but a dangerous, life-threatening problem that came with the job. In terms of how society treated them, these women were treated like they didn't exist by the decent people in town. They were often not allowed to walk on the main street during the day so that the wives and families wouldn't have to see them. If they needed to go shopping, they had to use the back door so no one would notice them. When they died, they were not allowed to be buried in the town's church cemetery because people considered them sinners. They were buried in a separate area, sometimes called Boot Hill, or just dumped in graves with no names outside of town. Even after death, they were kept apart from regular society and made to feel ashamed by the very same people who used their services. The violence they faced from customers was really bad, and there was no real police force around to keep them safe. Drunk cowboys would beat them, cut them, or choke them, and nothing would happen to those men. A woman like this was seen as worth less than a horse in the eyes of the law. There are real court records showing that a man was fined more for shooting a valuable cow than for killing one of these women. The sheriff would usually just call it an accident or not look into it at all. These women were the biggest victims of a very violent and unfair culture toward women. Some women tried to get out of that life by marrying one of their customers, but this happened way less than movies make it seem. Most men saw them as something to buy, not as someone to marry. Once a woman was seen as fallen, it was almost impossible for her to be accepted back into normal society. A few famous women who ran brothels, like Maddie Silks or Pearl DeVere, did become rich and powerful. They wore diamonds and ran fancy, expensive houses that served the richest men in town. But for every Pearl DeVere, there were 10,000 nameless girls struggling to survive in the cribs. Pearl DeVere was known as the Gold Dollar, and she charged up to $200 for a night. But even she couldn't escape the darkness, and she died from a morphine overdose on purpose. Money could buy nice silk dresses, but it couldn't buy happiness or peace inside your heart. The age of a saloon girl really mattered because being young was the only thing that gave her any value. A woman who was 30 years old was already seen as too old and was pushed down to cheaper and cheaper places. By the time she was 40, she was probably begging on the streets or had already died from being left out in the cold. These women often formed their own close little communities because they had no one else. They would put their money together to pay for a doctor or a funeral for one of their friends. It was a sisterhood built out of pain and held together by the same terrible experiences they all shared. The makeup they wore was thick and was often made of toxic ingredients. Like we talked about in our earlier video, they painted their faces to cover up bruises, sores, and how tired they looked. Under the low lights of the saloon, they looked beautiful, but in daylight, they looked like ghosts. They were also the main targets of human trafficking, where girls were kidnapped and forced to work. Young girls from China or Europe were promised waitress jobs and then locked inside brothels. There were prisoners who didn't speak English and had no way to ask anyone for help. The Chinese women working in San Francisco lived in conditions that people described as cages. They were fed through the bars and forced to keep working until they died of sickness or exhaustion. It was human trafficking happening on a massive scale right in the middle of the so-called American dream. As the West started to become more developed and civilized in the 1890s, religious groups started pushing their way in. These groups demanded that the red light districts be shut down to make the towns look cleaner and more respectable. But this didn't stop what was happening. It just pushed it into darker and more dangerous back alleys. The women were hit with big fines by the town courts, which trapped them in a cycle of debt they could never get out of. The town used those fines to pay for public schools and roads while still looking down on the women who were paying them. It was a total act of hypocrisy. The town was making money off the very thing it said it hated. We look back at the Wild West with a kind of warm, fuzzy feeling for the freedom and excitement of it all. But we have to remember that this so-called freedom was built on the suffering of the most helpless people. The saloon girl is not a symbol of fun and adventure, but a symbol of desperate survival. So the next time you watch a Western movie with a fun and happy dance hall scene, think about the truth behind it. Think about the cold cribs and the bottles of laudanum and the graves with no names out in the desert. And take a moment to feel something for the thousands of women who lived and died hidden in the shadow of the American frontier. Their names have been forgotten, and their faces are lost to history. But their story is a reminder that the past was a brutal and cruel place for anyone who didn't have power. We should respect their struggle by telling the real truth instead of the pretty made-up version.